Hello Internet, it's Skorakowski, and today we're going to discuss metagaming. It's a term that gets thrown out a lot in RPG communities, often with sort of a palpable disdain, making it clearly the worst thing ever. Or is it? When I was first introduced to the concept, way back when the world was young, it was simply described to me as being in and out of character knowledge, as in information that a player knows about a situation that their character would not. The most popular example of this is, let's say you're playing Dungeons & Dragons and your characters encounter a troll. With no experience in fighting trolls, the player characters immediately reach for their fire and acid weapons because, well, the PCs don't know that trolls regenerate and that fire and acid are their big weaknesses. The players do, and the players are acting on that out-of-character knowledge. It's considered cheating, or at least poor sportsmanship, and over the years that definition of metagaming has sort of grown and evolved into broader areas, things like game mechanics, access to world information, or other things that might damage game immersion. This is where it starts getting a little bit gray zone for me because while some things might technically be metagaming, I don't think that means that they're necessarily bad. However, a lot of gamers will see these and scream, "Oh no, that's meta," and just run away from it in fear of it getting on them because everything meta must be shunned. So let's break down metagaming, or at least how I see metagaming, and it can fall into three categories: bad metagaming, possibly metagaming, the sort of gray zone area with a lot of case-by-case and personal tastes, and then there's good metagaming, which, as the name implies, is good. First, let's look at bad metagaming. These are usually pretty easy to classify. You have things like your D&D troll that we mentioned earlier, or just any time that a player changes their character's behavior and strategy based off some sort of out-of-character knowledge, such as this. "Okay, Mike, your character's alone in the garage. What are you doing?"
"I'm gonna check the car of those college kids that came into the hotel."
"Okay, in the trunk you find several ceremonial knives and a blanket with dried blood on it."
"Aw, damn. Think I figured out who those murdering cultists are."
"Okay, let's cut to Todd. We last left you in the hotel restaurant playing poker with those college kids. What are you doing?"
"I'm gonna carefully unbutton the flap on my pistol's shoulder holster and get ready to draw."
"Why?"
'Cause they're the cultists."
"But your character doesn't know that yet." That's a clear case where the player knew information because they're sitting at the table with the other player as their characters gleaning that information. And even though those characters are very far away from each other, the player that's metagaming is playing their character as if they are now privy to the information that the player knows. And then you have other factors.
"Guys, we're gonna need to pick up some silver arrows." "Why?" "Because earlier when I got up, I saw behind Seth's screen and there were a bunch of werewolf minis."
"Oh.
Yes, my character would like to purchase some silver arrows."
And then, of course, you've got stories of players who learn what sort of module or adventure that the game master is running, so they run out and they read a copy of that module or adventure, read some reviews online, or in some ballsy cases, if the GM leaves the room, that player might get up and peek behind their screen and read the game master's notes. While yes, a player trying to learn all the adventure information out of game, that way they can use it in-game to their most advantage, it is metagaming, but I personally list it past that. It's cheating. Straight up, dishonest cheating. It's wrong, and the players know it's wrong. Now, some game masters then might try to twist things around on them and change the adventure up. That way, if the cheating player tries to use this information to their advantage, it now works to their disadvantage, and all of their ill-gained knowledge is now working against them. Sort of kind of a, I got you, switcheroo sort of thing. But not me. Once that level of trust has been lost, I am done playing with that player. I'm not going to prolong the problem out any further in some sort of pointless little exercise of "I caught you." I trust my players. Even when I'm running old modules and I have some veteran players that I play with, I check with them beforehand to see if any of them have ever played or read or run the particular adventure that I'm considering running. And occasionally I've had one say, "Yeah, I don't know. It was 30 years ago, so maybe I have, maybe I haven't, I don't know." And if they say that, I'll make any necessary changes in advance, or maybe I'll run it as is and just wait for the player. And if they say, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I do actually remember this, it's coming back to me, I just didn't remember the title or anything," I'm going to go ahead and change it at that point once the players let me know that they are familiar with the source material that I'm using. It's not that I fear them metagaming as much as I want to keep them surprised and not be able to anticipate what's coming next. I want it to be a more enjoyable experience for them. After all, Well, if the players told me that they're familiar with the source material, that's because I trust them and I trust that they're going to tell me if they are familiar with the source material. And I find it just a lot easier just to go ahead and trust your players. But once that trust is lost, I'm done playing with them. Another type of bad metagaming that's especially annoying is when it's done by a player who isn't even at the scene in question. These are what I call blurters. You've probably seen this before, the ones that like to blurt out stuff to the people who are actually playing the scene.
Dweebles, you find yourself locked in a stone room. Before you is 2 doors. One is made of obsidian and the other of jade. Let me think about this. Dude, the jade key that we found in that crypt, I bet it works on that door. Quiet, man, your character isn't there.
Blurters cause a whole mess of problems. One, they just stole the fun from the player who's actually playing the scene. The player who's trying to figure out the puzzle or the riddle, that was now stolen from them because the blurter just shouted out an answer. And two, the player who was actually playing the scene might not want to do the thing that the blurter told them to do now. Not because it wasn't a good idea or suggestion. The player might have actually come up with that on their own and just not voiced it yet before the blurter blurted out whatever it is that they should do. But the player is now afraid that they might be accidentally metagaming or paranoid that they might be accused of metagaming for using this information that the blurter shouted out at them. And the way that they correct this through their paranoia of metagaming is by metagaming and not doing the thing that their character was planning on doing because they don't want to be confused for metagaming. It's all really confusing. Back when I was young and we were all starting off gaming, and we had a big problem that we were all blurters. And what our dungeon master would do is he would penalize us anytime that we yelled out some sort of information when our character wasn't there. Something like 200 experience points. He'd point at us and go, "Give me 200 XPs. And then once I started dungeon mastering myself, I ended up having to adopt the same tactic. And we had to do this up through college because we all had issues with people yelling out answers to scenes that they're not in. Personally, I don't like having to do that. It kind of makes me feel dirty as a game master to have to find my players and scold my players. And I haven't had to do it in many, many years, and I'm very thankful about that. But it is a tactic that does work, so it has worked before. I just don't like doing it, and I'm thankful I don't have to anymore. Now, blurters aren't metagaming themselves. Their characters aren't changing their behavior due to the scene because their characters aren't even in the scene. But the blurter is trying to get the other players to metagame, to use this information that the blurter is shouting out at them, which is unsolicited information. So when it comes to metagaming and blurters are the ones that I suspect the most of it, the ones that I keep my eye on the most, because they're obviously very comfortable with the idea of metagaming, because they're regularly trying to get the rest of the players at the table to partake in metagaming. So that's all clearly bad metagaming. So let's get on to the next category, possibly metagaming. This is a messy category, and I'm sorry it's going to feel a bit all over the place as we go through this, because it really comes down to things that are difficult to identify or classify, or just personal preferences to the people around the table. Some games have metagaming mechanics. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition has inspiration, which can be awarded by a dungeon master as a reward for something that the player does. Players can then award their inspiration to other players in order to help them out or as a thank you for something that they might have done. Hollow Earth Expedition has something similar called style points that allows for extraordinary feats. And ways that you can earn style points include in-game behavior or even out-of-game behavior like bringing game food or managing the game diary. Conan has 2 metagaming mechanics. First, there's fortune points, which can be earned in similar ways as inspiration. And then we have the momentum pool, where players who roll more successes than they need in order to do something can now save these successes in a pool that they or the rest of the party can use later on. Cyberpunk 2020 has a luck mechanic where players can spend from their luck pool, increasing their chances of success for some particular role. Call of Cthulhu has a similar luck mechanic as well. However, some people don't like any of those mechanics. They see that if a player character is unsure about performing some sort of action, but then they do that action because that character, out of character they know, they have an inspiration pool or a luck pool or something like that that increases their chances, they see that as metagaming, and technically it is metagaming. But I don't see any of that as bad. It's not cheating, and they're using the rules, they're using the mechanics the way they're designed. I see these mechanics for luck and all of that as sort of that intangible lucky feeling that a hero gets that kind of says, I'm going to trust my feelings and do something super difficult here. This really just all falls under personal preference for me. Another mechanic that some game masters consider meta is hit points. They feel that a player knowing what their own hit points is not only ruins the immersion, but it can lead to potential, even if unintended, intentional metagaming, so these game masters keep track of all the hit points behind the screen. Personally, I don't think it's any sort of big deal that the players know what their own hit points are. I've already got enough stuff that I'm trying to keep track of behind the Game Master screen that I don't need any more paperwork, so I just let all my players handle their own hit points. However, this sort of segues us into the next portion, and that's a tactic that a lot of game masters do to kind of cut down on any metagaming or potential metagaming, and that's keeping your players ignorant, which to me starts to become a slippery slope. A couple weeks ago, I did a video on introductory combat tactics, really basic stuff. And one complaint that I received a couple times is that tactics like sticking together and combining attacks against powerful enemies was metagaming. Now, personally, I see it about as the same sort of rudimentary tactics that a standard Roman foot soldier would know, the kind of thing that a first-level player character might hear if they met a grizzled veteran in a bar who said, "Hey kid, buy me a drink and I'll tell you how not to die." But through these discussions with the commenters that were saying this was meta, I gleaned a little bit of information as far as why game masters don't like discussing simple tactics with their players, and it essentially came down to the fact that they fear that their players, when faced in these situations, are going to go with the more optimal thing to do rather than what their character would do. They're going to break character to do the thing that gives them the most pluses. Now, my first response to this is, what if the player character should know combat tactics, some of the basic tactics like that, because they have gone through training as a guard, or they had some sort of mentor or something like that? Wouldn't it be a better job for them to be able to play their character correctly if the players were all aware of what the proper tactics and mechanics for the game that they're playing is, and then trust that your players are going to do the right thing and play their characters accordingly? After all, this picture that I showed a second ago, this is a character package from MechWarrior, literally called Grizzled Veteran. These player characters should start off as seasoned pros. They're the ones accepting beers in exchange for tactical advice. Therefore, in order to play this character right, the players should know all of the advice that their character should be able to give. Personally, I find it's a lot easier just to go ahead and have your players know what all the optimal combat tactics are and the different aspects of the game mechanics that can be used to their advantage, and just trust them. Trust that they're going to play themselves in character and do the thing that's either more or less optimal, but is certainly what their character would do, than it is just to keep them in the dark and making all these less than optimal decisions because they don't know what to do, regardless of what their character knows to do. Game masters who intentionally try to keep all their players in the dark are more inclined to be the ones that, when they're playing Call of Cthulhu, tell all their players not to read Lovecraft or watch any of the movies. Same for Adventures in Middle-earth. Tell their players they shouldn't read the book or watch the movies either. That'll give them too much inside information. And God only knows how these game masters play Star Wars. These game masters who try to keep their players ignorant out of fear of a possible metagaming situation, they probably have less of an issue with metagaming at their table as much as they have an issue with the fact that they're over-controlling and restricting on their players, and it's going to be difficult for them to keep players for a long time because they're keeping such a stranglehold on the game. Keeping all your players ignorant of what the most optimal tactics and all that stuff is pretty easy to do if all you're playing with are totally green newbies. But if you're going to be playing with a long-running group where eventually all those newbies become seasoned veterans and very familiar with everything like that, they're eventually going to learn all these details that you've been trying to keep them ignorant of. Or even if your players are new to playing tabletop role-playing games, they might have gotten a lot of information about it before they ever played. Maybe they were interested in gaming because they've been watching some of the different gaming channels out there. How two of my players did it was by reading the monster manual and thinking to themselves, oh my god, this is cool, I want to play the game. So with players that you have, they're either seasoned veterans themselves, or they've just naturally picked up a lot of the lore and everything like that because they're very interested in gaming and they've been reading a lot of game materials, and now we're starting a new campaign and we've got these veterans or these newbies that have a lot of information. We start hitting a real gray zone as far as what the characters are allowed to know, and we shouldn't force them to pretend that they don't know the information that the players already know. So let's go back to that troll example.
Snarling, the creature sloshes through the swamp water toward you. Todd, you've got the initiative. What you gonna do? I'm going to take out my oil and flint. Now, your character doesn't know that fire is what kills trolls, and pulling out your oil and flint isn't your standard combat action. But I know it's a troll. Yeah, you might, but your character's never encountered a troll before. So, are you saying that our characters have never heard any of the stories, or the legends, or the bard songs, or our parents never warned us, you don't go into that swamp or those trolls will skin you alive and eat your face off? Okay, yeah, they do exist in your world, but your character's never seen one for themselves. So, my character's probably heard descriptions or maybe even seen it depicted on murals or on tapestries. I mean, I've never seen a platypus in real life, but I'm pretty sure that if a platypus came in this room right now and sat down at the table next to me, I could probably tell you what it was. That would be awesome! Okay, well, maybe an intelligence check could identify it as a troll. Not buying it. If you had said some sort of big green monster with rubbery skin was coming out of that swamp water, then maybe. But you said it was a troll, which means that you expect us to know what a troll is. But therefore, it could also be assumed that we know how to fight it. Look, guys, I know that you know what a troll is, but your characters inside the game don't. Fine, then I'm just going to attack it like normal. We'll get our asses kicked for a few rounds until God decides to tell us that it's okay that we figured it out. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun.
And the players are right there. Just because a character hasn't encountered something before doesn't mean that they don't know what it is. And now all the players at the table have to go through these hollow motions of pretending that they don't know, even though everyone in the room is completely aware of what's going on, getting their characters' butts kicked, and that's not fun for anyone at the table, Game Master included. So why pretend? If the fear of metagaming is so strong that it's making your game less than enjoyable, then that's a failure. Now, it can be tricky to determine what all your characters should know or should not know about the world around them, and different games do have different mechanics in order to help game masters and players out with that. Call of Cthulhu, for example, has the Mythos skill, so if a Call of Cthulhu character encounters a Mythos creature like a Shoggoth for the first time, the player can then roll their Cthulhu Mythos skill, and if they succeed, they remember some information about it from some old dusty tome that they might have read once, and depending on the level of success of that roll, might know some information on ways of dealing with that threat. So depending on what game it is that you're playing, it might be worth it to figure out some way of determining what the player characters might have heard as they were growing up inside this world, and different information about the creatures and lore. That way we don't have to continue to roleplay the act of discovery of information that everybody in the room is perfectly aware of. But even then, depending on what your players already know about the game and the world, it's sometimes just easier to let them have it than it is to pretend to be surprised about something that we all know. Is it metagaming? Yeah, but I see it as less harmful than forcing everyone into bad situations that no one enjoys being forced into because we all fear metagaming. If your players all know the game world, the Game Master's really only choice is to allow some sort of elasticity in what sort of metagaming that they're going to allow as far as knowledge about this world, or to go through the big effort of changing a lot of stuff about the world and the monsters. That way the players don't actually have any information that the characters wouldn't have, such as with that troll. Instead of describing it as big and green with rubbery skin, it's now small and furry and has 4 arms, and they encounter it, they don't know what it is, and through the process of fighting it, they begin to figure out what traits it has, and now it's a big surprise that they actually get to discover this information rather than pretending to discover this information. Finally, let's look at good metagaming. This is something that some people don't believe in, but I for one think is great for having a healthy and long-running group. So let's say you have that greedy thief character. Now, while it might be perfectly in character for that character to cut the rest of the party's throats and rob them while they sleep, they don't do that. Why? Well, because that's a dick move to do to the rest of the player characters, and not only could it hurt the player's relationship with the other players, it might get that player uninvited to the next game if they keep screwing over all the other PCs. So by metagaming and not having your character do the thing that might upset the rest of the party and the rest of the players, this is something that I encourage players to do. Don't upset the rest of the party and pretend it's in character. I've done a whole video on this. And not just that, there's also this.
Hey guys, I'm enjoying hanging out in this cantina as much as you are, but we only got 20 minutes left in this session. So let's just focus up and see if we can get on to the next scene before the game is done.
No matter how much immersion we have around the gaming table, the players are still perfectly aware that they're playing a game, and that's not all bad. Players might be able to step aside and allow another player to perform some sort of action in-game. Not because the first player's character couldn't do it, because they were trying to share the stage and not hog the spotlight and allow everybody else to, make the rolls and have a good time, and they don't want to hog the stage from everybody. So they're metagaming and allowing everybody else to play and feel more involved. Is it metagaming? You bet your butt it is, but it's also behavior that I encourage, that way everybody at the table can have more of a fun experience. So with metagaming, the only stuff that I personally consider bad is the stuff is where the player is going against the spirit of the game, essentially cheating when they know that they shouldn't be cheating. Good metagaming is good sportsmanship and player behavior that takes place both inside and outside the game itself, and the rest of it really just falls into that gray zone, which is primarily case by case or personal preference for whoever it is that's playing. But it's nothing that I have a problem with. All that gray zone stuff is nothing that I worry about, and I don't think it's anything that most people should really stress about. Metagaming in and of itself isn't bad. It's the situation or the intent behind the metagaming is all that matters, and that's really what we should instead focus on rather than is something or is something not meta.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to see some more of our stuff like game reviews and how-tos, just hit that subscribe button. Till next time, amigos, you have a great day.